Greetings, fellow scribes! Welcome back to the archive. This week's discussion is on Warhammer 40k 2nd edition, which is the edition I started playing in. This edition is in many ways different from the current editions, but at the same time has stuff that got brought back in the current 8th edition. I look forward to talking about this because this is very much a bit of a walk down memory lane for me. This is the edition that I kind of wish they went back to in many ways. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy as I talk about the 2nd edition of Warhammer 40,000. Normally when I talk about a game system, I spend a little bit talking about the setting. Warhammer 40,000 has in-depth lore, more than I can really justify in just a quick little snippet. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to link two of my favorite YouTube commenters and lore video experts down in the description. Arch Warhammer and Luton09. They're both going to be down in the description, so please check out their channels. They are great. Arch Warhammer is humorous, snarky, and just really conveys some of the what the heck are they thinking attitude that a lot of us longtime fans of 40k will have. And Luton is very much a matter-of-fact detailing the lore history and has even set up a new player primer. So shoutouts to those two great Warhammer 40k lore video makers. And now let's get into the discussion here. So, Warhammer 40k, like all the editions, is divided into phases. Now, the phases here differ greatly from what other editions had in terms of the order of them. Sort of. Every edition moves the psychic phase around somewhere different. 2nd edition, here was their turn order. The phase sequence. Movement phase, shooting phase, hand-to-hand combat phase, psychic phase. Yes, psychic phase was last in the order. Movement phase, you had 3 basic options with foot troops. Those options were walk, which was move their movement in inches, run, which was move double their movement, or charge. Charges had to be declared first. It's literally, the subsequence was declare charges, then move. Unlike other editions, a charge was a straight up run. And 2nd edition, like most of the early editions, had a no pre-measuring rule. So, if you didn't get into base-to-base contact, you did not succeed on the charge. And that was another fun thing. You had to get into base-to-base contact for close combat to initiate. As you moved the squad, you had to keep your squads within 2 inches of each other. The squad members within 2 inches of each other. Now, if you ran, you could not fire. However, it did not go by the unit. It went by the models. A common tactic back in the day was you'd have an anchor heavy weapons guy. He'd be on one end of the squad. The rest of the squad would move past him. because heavy weapons could not move and fire. So the rest of the squad would move past him with the guy on the farthest end, usually your other heavy weapons guy, running. And then the squad would thus leapfrog around, so you had one guy anchoring that end. Of course, when you charged, you made the declaration of the charge for the unit, and then you measured out. And of course, they still moved. But if they failed to charge, they were out in the open, couldn't shoot, and were literally sitting ducks. Shooting phase, of course, was the classic where most of the shooting happened. Well, actually, it's where all the shooting happened. And you would do your shooting in shooting phase. Now, there's a couple interesting things. First off, Space Marines had a special rule called rapid fire. This was something both Chaos Space Marines and Imperial Space Marines had. What this rule meant was, if they didn't move, they could fire twice. Full range, everything. They could fire twice. If they walked, they could fire once at full range or twice at short range. If they ran, they could fire once at a 12-inch range, once at the short range of their weapons. Now, the other thing is, there are weapons like artillery that you would target where it was, and then you would roll scatter die. Artillery used different dice for their deviation. Missiles, plasma cannons, stuff like that. It used a d6 and the scatter die. Artillery used the artillery die and the scatter die. And the artillery die could end up with an up to 32-inch deviation. It was entirely possible for your artillery shells to fall back onto your own position. And many a basilisk was lost to their Earthshaker cannon hitting them. Of course, there's also the fact that the deviation could go further than your maximum range. And so there were instances where people would actually be hoping for a scatter and a bit extra in a certain direction. But it is what it is. One weapon was really fun. The Eldar D cannon. This did not use the artillery dice. It used the scatter die and d6s. But it deviated twice because the weapon was so inaccurate. Because it was basically opening up a hole into the warp, pulling things into it. And of course, there's another thing that kind of went away. Sustained fire. And there were a number of weapons that used it was a 6-sided die, but one of the 1s and one of the 3s were replaced by a jam marker. And so it was you would roll this. If you jammed the weapon, you had to spend a turn clearing the jam. So the unit couldn't fire that weapon the next turn. Otherwise, they could fire up to 3 shots. And what made this interesting was there were a number of weapons that had sustained fire die. The most notable being the Storm Bolter, the Assault Cannon, and the Heavy Bolter. Storm Bolters had a 1 sustained fire die. Heavy Bolters had 2. And Assault Cannons had a whopping 3 sustained fire die. But they had a special rule that if all 3 jammed, the weapon exploded. Another fun weapon was the Cyclone Missile Launcher. See, in later editions, it was just a missile launcher for Terminators. The Cyclone Missile Launcher back in 2nd edition, however, had 12 missiles. You could fire them 1 at a time, 2 at a time, in any increment up to all 12. And the number you fired determined the size of the blast template you used. And let me phrase that. It wasn't really a blast template. You would actually use your tape measure and measure the radius. Because when you got to the largest size, the all 12 missiles, they didn't make a pie plate big enough. I want to say, and I could be misremembering this, that it was a 4-inch radius. And if you fired all 12 missiles, that was it. You were out. Gone. Kaput. But it was great for dealing with horde armies, because these were all crack missiles, not frag missiles. So these all punched through armor, did damage. And then there was the fun thing that if you still had missiles, and your guy with the Cyclone Missile Launcher died, you rolled on a chart to see what happened. The result could just be he fell down dead. It could be that all remaining missiles in his pack blew up for the radius of whatever number were left. Or the fun one. You began rolling on the scatter die for direction. As each missile went off 1 at a time, firing off as he spun around dying, the missiles cooking off and launching. I miss stuff like that. 2nd edition had some fun rules that they have dropped from other editions. Of course, we then get to close combat phase. Close combat phase, or hand-to-hand phase, worked way different from later editions. First off, if a model was in base-to-base contact with 2 enemy units, he attacked them both. And both got to attack him, provided they lived. Because it was everyone attacked on their initiative. So, say I have a Space Marine against 2 orcs. The orcs have lower initiative than the Space Marine. So the Space Marine is going to do his attacks first. He's going to attack the orc on his left first. He will roll his attack dice. That orc will roll his attack dice. And then you will add your highest die to your weapon skill. whoever got the highest weapon skill, the highest number on this, had one chance to wound. Now, if you rolled a 6, you had an automatic chance to wound. Even if your weapon skill was worse than your opponent's, and you rolled a 6, you still had a chance to wound. If you rolled a 1, your opponent got an extra chance to wound. Now, there were weapons that had a quality called Parry. These weapons were, of course, swords and lightning claws. There were some other weapons that had other opportunities to parry, but the main ones were those. Lightning claws, you had 2 lightning claws, so you had 2 chances to parry. Swords, most of the time you only had 1 sword, so only 1 chance to parry. If by chance you had 2 swords, then you had an extra attack and 2 chances to parry. And we say chances to parry, but it's really just parry. And when you parried, you looked at your opponent's dice and you told him which die you were having him re-roll. Most often you would want him to re-roll those 6s. And then what would then happen is you would look at who won that, determine how many chances to wound each side had, roll your chances to wound, roll your damage, and then if your guy survived, he'd then go do the other opponent. And the same thing would play out. And then the 2 units on him would then get to attack. There are units that were really damn good at close combat. Space Marine Terminators with lightning claws. Gene Stealers. Okay, pretty much any Tyranids were great close combat. Gene Stealers, though, had this tendency to absolutely slaughter units because there would be so many of them on a model, and they have so many attacks. Nothing usually got past their 4 parries. Of course, then we came to Psychic Phase. Psychic Phase, your Psychers, based on their level, had cards for their powers. These cards were randomly dealt from the disciplines that they could take. And so, you didn't actually get to pick what you could do. And there were cards dealt for what the flux of the warp was. And these would tell you how many charges you had. And you could store charges on force weapons. If you store charges on force weapons, you could do things later like use those charges to up the strength of that weapon, up the damage and all that. Or you could use them for powers later. And how you dealt with enemy psychers hitting you with powers was your psyker drew a nullify card. That was the only way to stop a psychic power from going off. Now, one issue with the game was how was damage dealt? Well, damage was dealt in the normal attack sequence. Normally it's you attack. If you hit, you have a chance to wound. So you would roll to see if you wound. Then, the weapon you use imposed a modifier on the target enemy's saving throws. So they would make their saving throw roll. If they failed, then they would take damage based on the weapon. Most weapons did 1 damage. The heavier weapons did multiple dice damage. Something that's been dropped from later editions was that the chainsword was actually a viable weapon, even though its strength was lower and its AP mod was lower than power weapons. And this was because chainswords did multiple wounds, because they were a chainsaw on a sword. So as you laid that into someone, it would go chang and just start cutting through. But they dropped that in later editions. The chainsword in later editions is really just kind of bleh. But it also had a higher armor penetration than a normal sword, than a power sword. And armor penetration was important, not because of what would become in later editions, but because armor penetration is how you damaged vehicles. Because here's how vehicles worked. They had an armor value. This armor value could be ridiculously high, like the 20s on some of the Lehman Russes. And what you would have to do to damage a vehicle is you would roll a set of armor penetration die based on the weapon you were shooting. And if the number on your result equaled or exceeded the armor value on the vehicle you shot, it would penetrate. And once you penetrated a vehicle, you looked at where you hit. And, depending on what angle you were shooting from, you would roll to see where you were hitting, and then you'd roll your armor penetration. And whenever you penetrated the armor on a vehicle, you would roll dice, and those would tell you what happened. And, there could be no effective results, all the way up to the ammo explodes, the vehicle goes kerblooey, no survivors. It was not necessarily easy to kill a vehicle in 2nd edition. Vehicles were worth every bit of those points, because it could literally take several squads concentrating fire on a Lehman Russ to take it down. Meanwhile, it's laying waste around it. Now, a fun fact with vehicles was just because the vehicle was destroyed didn't mean everything in it was gone. You could have a vehicle destroyed, and there were specific results where, yes, the vehicle is destroyed, but the crew bailed out and are on the field fighting with their sidearms. This might mean you had a Lehman Russ crew out on the field with las pistols. Or you had 2 extra Space Marines on the field with bolt pistols. But that is a brief overview of how 2nd edition 40k worked. was a very different, very fun alternative, at least to my mind, of the later editions. So, with that, I will end the discussion for this week. Next week, I will be discussing 3rd through 5th editions, as they're all pretty much the same rule set, just with tweaks along the way. So, until then, if you like this video, please click like and subscribe down below. Selecting the little bell icon will get you notified of future updates on this channel. And till next week, I just want you all to remember to have fun and keep gaming.